Well, slain whistleblower and senior accountant in the health department, Babitha Deokaran's quest for answers and accountability is bearing fruit. The SIU has continued investigating suspicious payments totaling 850 million rand made by the Tembisa Hospital to various entities, many of which were shell companies, resulting in the suspensions now of its CFO Lerato Madyo and the head of the hospital, Ashley Mthunzi. The hospital said this is so their presence doesn't impede their investigation. It also said it did this given the seriousness of the allegations and the possible link to Deokaran's murder. Political analyst and author of The Enemy Within, How the ANC Lost the Battle Against Corruption, Mpumelelo Mkhabela joins me now. Mpumelelo, good evening to you, and thank you so much. It's so lovely to talk to you again. It's been ages. But I want to go to this piece that you wrote about this type of scenario, but also more broadly speaking. And you coined an interesting term, procurement terrorism. Yes. Just explain what that means.
Well, the word is derived obviously from the the phrase is derived from the two words, terrorism and procurement. So the definition of terrorism, whether it's a legal definition or dictionary definition or whichever way you look at it, the commonality around it is that it's a terrorist is somebody who wants to secure something, typically a political goal, using violence, either actual violence or the threat of violence. It can work as an individual or they can work as a group. So in this case, the threat of violence or the actual violence itself, as in the case of Babitha Deokaran, is that the aim was to secure commercial gain as well as political gain. So political gain in a sense that the people behind the whole thing clearly were involved in trying to weaken the state. If you try to weaken the state's procurement or systems or rules or regulations or the laws and all of that, it's a political end that you seek to achieve. But it's not, you're not seeking to do that as an end on its own. You're also seeking to do that as a way eventually to get your hands into the coffers of the state. So there's that other element of the commercial element. So procurement terrorists use the threat of violence or violence itself to actually weaken the state and thereafter to actually get their hands into the coffers of the state to steal public money. That's the essence of it.
So what you're pointing to then essentially is a puppet master, a mastermind, in the shadows, skillfully pulling the strings. When you observe this particular situation, and we'll get back to some of the other themes around political connectedness in a moment, what are you observing about who these individuals might be?
Well, it's very clear. If you look at what the News 24 investigative journalists have done, they've first of all managed to establish that Babitha Deokaran was very concerned about her safety. And
she raised it.
And she raised it with her seniors. And number two, it is now obviously clear that her fears became real when she was killed, shortly after she started probing these suspicious transactions at the Tembisa Hospital. So those facts are not disputed. And then it's clear, all that is required right now, basically, is to link her fear, to link the procurement transactions she was investigating, and to link the assassins to the mastermind. Because typically, terrorism works like this. There's always people that are like at the nerve center of the entire organizational system. And then there are people that are deployed to do the execution, to do the threatening, to do the violence. So what has not been established at the moment is whether these people that have been arrested can be linked to someone who's a kingpin, either inside the department or outside the department.
And when you look at the anatomy of corruption and alleged corruption in this particular scenario, some of it is so blatant. There's a network of a corrupt enablement.
Yes.
Right? So when you think about this unconscionable and blatant record of purchases, such as the purchase of things like, non-medical items, skinny jeans to the tune of, 500 million rand or so.
Yes.
What you're talking about right now, it needs the insiders to make this happen, to aid and abet such a heinous scheme.
Yes, it's impossible for a terrorist from outside, a procurement terrorist from outside, to infiltrate the state without someone inside enabling them. So there's someone from outside wanting to steal money from the state. He needs enablers, but the enablers also get paid. And then in the process, they're able to collaborate, they're able to steal. And typically, there's always a political connection as well, because the political connection, what they do is because they actually, first of all, they are able to appoint people to positions, the politicians, right? Through what is called deployment or cadre deployment, whatever you call it. And secondly, they are in charge of the entire political system of government. So they can manipulate. They know where budgets are going on time, even before we know as citizens, before budgets are tabled in parliament. They already know where priorities will be. So they can plan in advance. They know where they're going to eat. They know they're going to eat with who. So the enabler inside government is at the heart, in my opinion, of this procurement terrorists. Because without that enabler, no outsider can come into government.
You know, when you hear stories like this, and as you say, if you just connect the dots, which is now, you know, ubiquitous term in South Africa, it can be really simple to identify what's gone on and to understand the desperation of those who want to remain invisible and unknown, heightened or actually carried out in this way where you see someone actually killed and murdered. What you also point out in your writing is that the response of the health department, which actually is where the buck stops in terms of making sure that there is accountability and enforcement of the rules, and also, you know, punishment for those who've done wrong. That what how you see them respond to, a situation like this, especially with regard to the suspensions of the CFO and the head of the hospital, doesn't go far enough.
It doesn't, especially look at the timing, Iman. I mean, Babita died exactly a year ago, and the suspensions are happening now. You can imagine if any of the people that were suspended, hypothetically, maybe were involved, right? What did they do in the last 12 months to cover their tracks? Obviously, they've done a lot. If they know, or they know somebody was involved, or whoever was involved is connected to them, or they themselves were involved. So obviously, they've now tried to cover their tracks. So the slow pace with which government responds to such things is very worrying. For me, that's the major issue. And the second issue is this, that how come is a private media publication is able to access all this information, I would say relatively quicker, given the fact that they're outside the state, right? And they're able to access all these details. And why is it that nobody in government has been able to access these things? And for me, it calls into question the role of, for example, the executive in Gauteng, the role of the premier, the role of the MEC for health, the role of the legislature. We often forget when we deal with this corruption that we have these oversight institutions in the provinces called provincial legislatures, whose job is basically to play the oversight role over the executive, over the MEC. So the moment such a thing happens, it's highlighted in the media, or someone dies, you would expect that immediately the Gauteng provincial legislature portfolio committee on health and public accounts will come together, will call all those people that have been that are responsible in the value chain of decision making, put them together and ask them tough questions. It never happens. Premier David Makhura only now, after 12 months after Babita was killed, only now appoints a forensic auditor to go through those. So since she was killed, what has happened with those transactions? So eventually, well, it's a good thing that, well, eventually something's being done. And we should say thanks to the journalists who brought this to the public attention. But someone might eventually be caught and something might happen and all of that. But it's really worrying how much tracks have been covered already.
And so much money and such tragic circumstances. Mkhabela, thank you very much, Mpumelelo, for joining us. Really do appreciate your time this evening. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Take care. Political analyst and author of The Enemy Within, Mpumelelo Mkhabela.